Hello, everyone. Welcome to my last video for AP Psychology here at Northwood High School. And I just want to tell you it's been a wonderful journey. I hope that you found these videos helpful. Certainly not perfect. Maybe, please give us feedback because next year maybe we need to fix up a couple of the videos. And this is really, Ms. Trincheri and I's first attempt. Today's topic is going to be social psychology, which is the last unit, unit 9. We are going to be in modules 77 and 78, which has to do with prejudice, discrimination, and aggression. So kind of negative, but really important topics. And I just want you to know that I wanted to just start by saying that these are uncomfortable conversations, and I feel uncomfortable, and here I'm able to see myself and my own level of uncomfortableness in this conversation, or just, for me to be presenting it to you. And I've struggled with it every year. I think many people struggle with this. When we talk about things that are negative and uncomfortable, sometimes we just avoid the conversation. I think it's pretty apparent now that we need to have it. But it's not just the conversation. There is action that needs to occur as well to really reduce the prejudice, the discrimination, and for us to be more loving and less aggressive and, be supporting each other. So, I am really taking time to think and reflect myself about areas that I need to improve. And I am hoping that you will do the same too in your own lives, and how you can also help and uplift everybody. So I'm going to go through some of these topics. I will tell you that when it comes to the AP exam, a lot of this stuff is not really expected to be on it. We're going to go through the concepts. We'll talk about some of the research. All right, so we actually need to start here at the beginning. So we're going to start with prejudice and discrimination. And prejudice is an unjustifiable, usually negative attitudes towards a group and its members. We know that it can involve stereotyping, which is making generalizations about a group, and then also can lead to the behavior which is discrimination, and that's which is an action. All right, and we prejudge people. Usually includes prejudice attitudes, usually include negative emotions, hostility or fear, stereotypes, as we mentioned, which are generalized beliefs about a group of people. And it's going to predispose you to take action that would be discriminatory. And we said again, the main thing they tend to ask on the AP exam is making sure that you know the difference between prejudice and discrimination, that it's the belief is the prejudice and the behavior is the discrimination. And they give an example here that you may believe that people that are elderly are very forgetful, but it could lead you to maybe not want them for a job because you think they're going to be forgetful. That would be the discriminatory behavior. All right, what would you answer here? Just making sure I was recording. Okay. Oh, sorry. Let me go back. All right, so yes, the correct answer is A. As always, you guys are so smart. Prejudice is cognition, discrimination is behavior. Ethnocentrism, we don't talk about as often, but that's assuming the superiority of one's ethnic group. So whatever ethnic group you are, if you kind of have these underlying beliefs, prejudice attitudes that your group is superior to others, that would be ethnocentrism. We talk a lot about what is implicit versus explicit. Something that is explicit, we are aware of it. It's on your radar screen. So if you actively are talking about a prejudice attitude, or you see someone else talking about, their beliefs about a certain racial, ethnic group, that would be explicit. But we have more internalized underlying beliefs that and knee-jerk, we call it knee-jerk responses that are below the radar that could leave us unaware of how our attitudes are influencing our behavior. So you're unaware of it. We're going to be doing this in class. We're going to look at this implicit association test, and we'll look at it more specifically, and it will address, and you will identify maybe some of your implicit biases. So we're going to skip over this and do this in class. All right. So just quick thing, your body tends to respond differently if you've got a prejudiced attitude. So your body language can kind of give it away sometimes. And they've noticed it when doing brain scans. And it's activating more of like the amygdala, which is the fear part of the brain and things like that. All right, make sure you know the differences. Stereotype, generalization, prejudice is the attitude, and discrimination is the behavior. Let's look at this graph about a particular attitude. So this is talking about the support for interracial dating over the last 30 years. And the good news is, if you interpreted the graph kind of quickly, is that it absolutely has improved. The support between Blacks and whites, for example, has increased. The support for interracial dating has increased dramatically from 48% in 1987 to 86% in 2012. But that doesn't mean we still don't, it doesn't mean that we don't have racism and many other concerns with, discrimination and systemic racism and things of that sort. So here are some of the lingering prejudices. People with darker skin tones experience greater criticism and accusations of immoral behavior. In one study of white medical students and residents, 1 in 3 believe Black people's skin is thicker than white people's skin, which led them to make harmful treatment recommendations. That's concerning and upsetting. Although many people say they would feel upset with someone making racist or homophobic slurs, they respond indifferently when they actually hear prejudice-laden language. So that is where you don't necessarily respond, and maybe you say. That's where cognitive dissonance might be occurring. So next time, say something. I don't like to hear that. That is racist. It's inappropriate. We are going to skip over this also because this is kind of part of the implicit bias. But I will give you an example here. This is a very concerning one. In 1999, Amadou Diallo was accosted as he approached his apartment house doorway by police officers they were looking for a rapist. When he pulled out his wallet, they perceived it immediately as a gun, riddled his body with 19 bullets from 41 shots. So they implicitly just immediately responded and reacted that it was a gun. We have the other tragedy that you guys are probably familiar with, Trayvon Martin. Of course, we have more recent things like George Floyd, that it revealed an implicit racial bias that started a national conversation about race, gun control, and social justice. As Trayvon Martin walked alone to his father's fiance's house in a gated Florida neighborhood, a suspicious resident started following him. A confrontation led to the unarmed Martin being shot. The one thing they don't mention here is a big thing is that he was stereotyping and obviously a prejudiced attitude because Trayvon Martin was wearing a hoodie and immediately perceived that as something suspicious and, potential leading to criminal activity. Trayvon Martin's death sparked public outrage, and people wondered, had Martin been an unarmed white teen, would he have been perceived and treated the same way? So when we're talking about gender prejudice, it does still exist. It has declined. 1/3 of Americans who in 1937 told Gallup pollsters that they would vote for a qualified woman whom their party nominated for president, that was only 1/3 in 1937, but now it's soared to 95%. And they certainly, 65% of people, and this is across the world, do believe that it's important that women have the same rights as men, although we certainly know in other countries, it is the inequity and the lack of justice and the horrible treatment of women does still exist. There is implicit prejudice, and you pay more to those who care for our streets and those women who care for our children. So meaning there is definitely still, income inequities, and we pay less to women even for the same job. So it is improving, and we also still have it with intelligence. It says, despite equality between the sexes and intelligence scores, the actual scores, people tend to perceive their fathers as more intelligent than their mothers, and their sons as brighter than the daughters. And it happens with social orientation as well. Explicit anti-gay prejudice, though it is declining in Western countries, still persists. Here are some numbers. In the national surveys of LGBTQ teens, 39% reported having been rejected by a friend or a family member because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. 58% reported being subject to slurs or jokes, and this is the most concerning one. 80% of LGBTQ adolescents reported sexual orientation-related harassment in the prior year. That needs to change. Gays and lesbians are also America's most at-risk group for hate crimes. So when we talk about making positive change, these are the things we need to address, which we certainly know there is more awareness, but we still need more action to help reduce this. And we do know, obviously, when we talk about ethnocentrism, that ethnicities and at certain events and things that happen in our country will increase people's fears, which will lead to more prejudice attitudes, more discrimination. And that's what happened here after 9/11. And this was prejudice against Muslims. There is something called the just world phenomenon that is these are a little bit of some of the explanations and not justifications, although in this sense, people believe this, that sometimes people have a tendency to believe the world is just or fair, and people therefore get what they deserve and deserve what they get. So meaning overall, in the end, you are going to get what you deserve. That's the just world phenomenon. And I want to look at this. So what it's saying here, there is no justice in the world. Here's this little small fish. It can't defend it, defend themselves. And then this one's saying there's some justice, which he's about to eat the small one. And then this one says, who has complete power and control, says this is a just world. Everybody's going to, in the end, get what they deserve. The just world phenomenon reflects the common idea that good is rewarded and evil is punished. It's easy then to assume that those who succeed must be good and those who suffer must be bad. So it's almost like a justification of saying, oh, well, poor people in the end are just lazy and they are getting ultimately what they deserve, with their addictions and all that stuff. So you can see how that is prejudice attitude leads to discrimination. They said when slavery exists in the United States, slaveholders perceived slaves as innately lazy, ignorant, and irresponsible, as having them the very traits that justified enslaving them. Which of the following accurately describes the just world phenomenon? And I'll pause for a moment here. It is the belief that most people get what they deserve and deserve what they get. Another theory or a concept we need to look at when looking at prejudice and discrimination is the in-group versus the out-group. The in-group is whatever group you're in, people whom you share a common identity. The out-group is them. It's the other group that's outside of the group that you exist in. And we do this naturally with sports teams, obviously, it'd be, Northwood against Blair, but we also might do it when it comes to just how we feel about our own ethnicity, our gender, our race, and that everybody else is them, the out-group. And you can immediately predict how that can potentially lead to prejudice and discrimination, or that is a prejudice attitude potentially. We have something called in-group bias, which is favoring your own group. So how would this cartoon be an example of in-group bias? Yeah, they're both mimes. I think they're mimes, right? And so just assuming that he's qualified and doesn't even have a resume there. Which of the following is an example of in-group bias? It is E. Derek believes his T-ball team is the best in the league and that the other teams in the league have no talented players. So we just talked about in-group bias and in-group versus out-group. You know, the only exception to that rule, like we know that it can lead to prejudice and discrimination, is that we do need to just recognize that the in-group is Miss Jessel's class and the out-group is Miss Trincheri's. No, I'm just kidding. Just kidding. Just a little joke in there. So we are the one group. We are the AP Psychology in group. And then there's that AP World. No, I'm just kidding. I'm going to stop now. All right. How do negative emotions nourish prejudice? So we know that when facing death, fearing threats, or experiencing frustration, people cling more tightly to their in-group and their friends. So when you feel threatened, you might go to these early implicit biases that lead to more prejudiced attitudes, which can lead to following more stereotypes. You know, you're maybe doing it for your own protective measures, but yet we know how that can increase like terrorism, or I'm sorry, that your fears of terrorism and heightened patriotism can just lead to more aggression, which we're going to talk about in the next module. And that in itself obviously is going to lead to discriminatory behavior and increased prejudice attitudes. There's something called scapegoating, and that is where we are, when you're feeling, you have that prejudice attitude and you need to have like some type of outlet, you need someone to blame, right? So the example I give, I'm going to give a different one here. So scapegoat theory notes that when things go wrong, finding someone to blame can provide a target for our negative emotions. So during the recession, maybe, for example, people might start scapegoating and just say that that immigrants are taking the Americans' jobs, and that is, you know, the reason why the pay has gone down or something like that. So they, you know, people maybe they themselves didn't find a job, and it could be for various reasons, has nothing to do with immigration, but they need someone to blame, or they feel they need someone to blame, and it's not justified. The evidence exists for the scapegoating theory of prejudice. It has to do with economically frustrated people, which is what I just mentioned, tend to express heightened prejudice, and experiments to create temporary frustration intensify prejudice. Yeah, so here's an example that you might relate to. Students who experience failure or are made to feel insecure often restore their self-esteem by belittling a rival school or another person. So just, you know, pay attention when you may be scapegoating. So I am actually going to skip over this, but I'm just going to say generally, it's a lot of words here. We do naturally categorize. We categorize, I mean, you know, chemists categorize. We're always categorizing things. We learned from Gestalt that we like to group things, but we have to pay attention. Is our categorization leading to negative attitudes and leading to discriminatory behavior? All right. So when we categorize people into groups, we often stereotype, and we perceive out-group homogeneity. You know with me how I pronounce things. Okay, but you know, the greater point is, which is my next thing, there's something called the other race effect. It's the tendency to recall faces of one's own race more accurately than faces of other races. So we're more familiar with our own race and maybe some of the facial features, body features, whatever. And we may make assumptions and assume that other races are more similar than they really are, rather than recognizing the distinctions between ours. I feel like I need to rephrase that, but let me back up a second. Okay. So within our own race, we are going to tend to recognize the distinctions and see the differences with us, with our facial features, body, body differences. But with other races, we might make assumptions that are outside of our own race that they are more similar than they really are. Oh, and we also have own age bias, better recognition memory for faces of our own age group. Here's a really good example. So what they did here is they had some New Zealanders that were either of European descent or Chinese descent. And then they had them try to classify the different faces as more Caucasian or more Chinese. And those of the European descent, more often than those of the Chinese descent, classified the ambiguous middle two as Chinese. And the reason being, okay, is researchers believe this happens because after learning the features of the familiar racial group, the observer's selective attention is drawn to the distinctive features of the less familiar. So they're drawn to it, which makes them make an assumption that they must be more, of the Chinese, of the race of Chinese versus the Caucasian. So pay attention to that. Here's a little cartoon that's showing the other race effect. You're Bob. Sorry, you researchers all look alike. So he's just saying they all kind of look alike, not recognizing that he's Bob. He's a different researcher. He's not just like all the other ones. That is the other race effect. What is the best explanation for why Carl, an African American, was better able to describe the African American man who robbed his store than he was able to describe the Caucasian man who was with him? Answer is D, the other race effect. I'm going to pause for a moment and tell you that I actually have, when we're talking about making change and where there's systemic racism and where it exists, this is a prime example. I am going to be taking this, my plan is to take this slide out, or maybe I'll leave it in as a discussion every year, but I don't agree with this slide. I think that there is a lot of stereotyping assumptions about African-American males that, are more likely to commit a crime, or that we make these stereotypes, that we have implicit biases about that how are we going to stop it? Well, first off, why do we need to give an example of an African-American man robbing a store and an African-American man identifying him more quickly? I feel we very well should have put a Caucasian man was better able to describe the Caucasian man who robbed the store. I think so. That was my little tangent about that. So what I mean is, I think we need to look through our curriculum, and we need to recognize, what are some of the underlying messages that we're sending with even examples that we're providing. So I think this one should be taken out. But since we're talking about prejudice and discrimination, maybe I'll leave it in as a continuation of describing examples of maybe where racism, systemic racism exists. All right, so there's something called the availability heuristic. You guys learned this in the cognition unit when we talked about problem solving. And it's when we estimate the likelihood of events based on how fast they come to mind. So something that becomes more readily, more vivid memory you have, and it comes to mind more quickly, might lead you to faulty thinking. And here's an example with, prejudice attitudes. And in one experiment, researchers showed two groups of University of Oregon students lists containing information about 50 men. The first group's list included 10 men arrested for non-violent crimes such as forgery. The second group's list included 10 men arrested for violent crimes such as assault. And when they were asked how many men on their list had committed any sort of crime, you could probably make a prediction that the second group, they overestimated the amount of crimes because they had more vivid memories. They were using the availability heuristic and pulling up examples more vividly of like a violent crime. All right, how do we move away from prejudice? If your gut check reveals sometimes you have feelings you would rather not have about other people, remember this. It is what we do with our feelings that matters. So maybe being awareness and recognize our own prejudices, but stop with that. Don't have it lead to inaction. By monitoring our feelings and actions and by replacing old habits with new ones based on new friendships, we can work to free ourselves from prejudice. All right, so that was it on prejudice and discrimination. We're going to have more in-depth conversations in class. So my last video, part of the video is on aggression. Okay, and I'm not going to get aggressive that I have to talk about aggression as my last video. No, I'm just kidding. I have no hostilities. I know it's important to talk about. What is aggression? In psychology, aggression is any physical or verbal behavior intended to harm someone, whether done out of hostility or as a calculated means to an end. I want to give you these examples here of whether something is aggressive or not. The assertive, persistent salesperson, that's not being aggressive. They're just being assertive. The dentist who makes you wince with pain, unfortunately, the dentist has to do that. That's not aggression. But the high school gossip who passes along a vicious rumor about you, the bully who torments you in person or online, and the attacker who mugs you for your money, that is aggression because it is a physical or verbal behavior intended to harm someone. There are genetic factors, there are neural influences, and there are biochemical influences when we think of the biology of aggression. When we look at identical twins, and you remember they've got the same genes, having a violent temper, the other twin will often independently emit the same. So these could be twins that are separated at birth, so they have different environments, but they are going to be more likely both have levels of aggression or having a violent temper. Two genetic markers in those who commit violent acts are the Y chromosome and the monoamine oxidase A. So you don't have to memorize that, but do notice they are recognizing some genetic predisposition and that there's an actual genetic marker, which helps break down the neurotransmitters such as dopamine and serotonin. There's no one spot of the brain. They do notice there are two structures that they are recognizing some additional brain activity and things in the amygdala and the frontal lobe. And this is really interesting, and a lot of people don't know about this, but I'm gonna talk about it, and I actually added a little picture to demonstrate it. What role does the hormone testosterone play in aggression? The facial width is testosterone length. So the width of your face is testosterone linked. A high facial width to height ratio is a predictor of men's aggressiveness and prejudicial attitudes. Other high testosterone linked traits among males include irritability, assertiveness, impulsiveness, hard drug use, and low tolerance for frustration. So here's an example. Oh, I had a picture here. There it is. Information, but don't stereotype, correlation, not causation. So they're recognizing a correlation with testosterone and that consider the high threat face because it's the wider, the width, and linked to more testosterone. But, we have to be careful when we get information like that because we don't want to go around measuring everybody's face and be like, oh, you must be aggressive. But it is interesting to look at they also talk about finger length and all that related to testosterone, and I'll demonstrate that in class. But it is interesting. So there is definitely a biology with aggression. Females with high testosterone levels, the hyena's unusual embryology pumps testosterone in female fetuses. The result is revved up young female hyenas who are born to fight. So definitely testosterone is correlated. All right, move on. So we got to also pay attention. Alcohol 100% plays a role in increasing the likelihood of aggression. It unleashes aggressive responses to frustration. Across police data, prisons, and surveys and experiments, aggression-prone adults are more likely to drink and to become violent when intoxicated. Alcohol is a disinhibitor. A disinhibitor makes you, not thinking about your actions, so you're disinhibited. It slows brain activity that controls judgment and inhibitions. Under its influence, people may interpret ambiguous acts as provocations and react accordingly. So meaning like if you've been drinking a lot, that you might just look at some type of ambiguous act that somebody's doing and see it as a threat. There are social cultural factors that trigger aggression: aversive events, reinforcement, modeling, and self-control, and media models. You guys are familiar with this, but we're going to quickly go through it. This is the main term for the section. There's not many terms for this module, but this one you definitely want to know. It's called the frustration aggression principle. It's the principle that frustration, the blocking of an attempt to achieve some goal, creates anger, which can generate aggression. So meaning like the more you're frustrated, the more there's frustration in that environment or situation that you're in, that the more likely that you might engage aggressively or act aggressively. I like to always give the example of like playing video games sometimes, right? Think of your level of aggression when you're playing video games, because they clearly are trying to frustrate you, right? With all the obstacles and challenges in the video game. But even things like hot temperatures, physical pain, personal insults, foul odors, cigarette smoke, crowding can evoke hostility. The prime example of this phenomenon: frustration creates anger, which can spark aggression. Even hunger, being hangry. All right, so here's an example of temperature and retaliation. Researchers looked for occurrences of batters who were hit by pitches during the 4 million plus pitcher batter matchups across 57,000 Major League Baseball games since 1952. And let's look. Look at the temperature. Wow, definitely correlation. Hotter, more aggressive. Probability of batter being hit by a pitcher increased if one or more of the pitcher's teammates had been hit, and also with the temperature. All right, so it had to do also with like a teammate that had been hit, and so then they were more likely to hit. But the temperature also played a key role here. More frustrated. Brandt's football team just barely lost the state championship game after a questionable referee call. As a result, Brandt gets angry and starts shouting insults. Which of the following terms best identifies this chain of events? The chain of events: frustration, aggression principle, C. So we also know that reinforcement, that children could learn if they are being positively reinforced to engage in aggressive acts, that they might be more likely to engage in those aggressive acts in the future. So, and then modeling, obviously, if you are growing up in an environment where there is physical punishment or abuse, a lot of times we think that if you grew up in a home where, like, let's say, and I'm very sorry if some of you guys have had this, and I know it happens, and please reach out if this is happening in your home. But let's say if you grew up in a home where your father was abusing your mother physically, that unfortunately we'd like to think that we would never do the same, but that modeling there is a correlation. It does increase the risk that you might engage in the same response when you are frustrated or you're angry. And the good news is the awareness helps change that. So to foster a kinder, gentle world, we must have best model and reward sensitivity and cooperation from an early age, perhaps by training parents to discipline without modeling violence. You know, I used to kind of yell when I was early parenting, and I really have taken a lot of time and effort to stop that, because I just realized that sometimes even just my anger and the modeling of the anger wasn't good. And I had somebody say to me one day, I'm kind of giving you personal information, but I feel like I want to share this. Somebody said to me one time, like, you value non-emotional or not being emotional. And I said, you know, if I've given you that perception, that's not what I mean. I absolutely believe we have times that we are going to be angry, and we have a reason to be upset, and cry and be scared and all of those unfortunate negative emotions. But I think most of the time, at least when it comes to how we're responding, that responding without aggression and without, like, you know, real intense anger, that most of us don't feel good when we are acting in real anger, even when we have a justification for being upset. It's just how we overall express that. And then the media, we know the media does play a role, especially with young children. An adolescent boy faced with real life challenge may act like a man, at least like an action film man, by intimidating and eliminating the threat. And then there's something called a social script. It's a culturally modeled guide for how to act in various situations. And we certainly know media plays a role in this. Media violence primes us to respond aggressively when provoked and teaches us social scripts, culturally provided mental files of how to act in certain situations. As more than 100 studies confirm, humans sometimes imitate what they have viewed. So if you really pay attention to what you watch, you know, your TV shows, your movies, the TikToks, all that, start looking for some of those social scripts. What are the messages about how we should act? Are we to act gently, you know, with kindness, with cooperation, with compassion? Or is there a lot where we are looking to, that we're shown in the social script is that we act aggressively? And we'll talk about that more in class. So this is a social script. In 2002, 3 young men in Michigan spent part of the night this really upsets me, drinking beer and playing Grand Theft Auto 3. Using simulated cars, they ran down pedestrians and beat them with fists, leaving a bloody body behind. These same young men then went out on a real drive, spotting a 38-year-old man on a bicycle. They ran him down their car, got out, stomped and punched him, and returned home to play the game some more. The victim, a father of three, died 6 days later. This really upsets me. I know people play Grand Theft Auto, and we're going to talk about like video games and does it promote aggression and violence and all that. And it doesn't mean that everybody who plays Grand Theft Auto is going to become aggressive. I don't think we're saying that, but we're going to talk a little bit more further. But we certainly know this is an example of if they were playing excessive amounts of Grand Theft Auto, was that becoming like a social script for them? So video games can prime aggressive thoughts. It can decrease empathy and increase aggression. University men who spent the most hours playing violent video games have also tended to be the most physically aggressive. Studies of young adolescents reveal that those who play a lot of video games become more aggressive and see the world as more hostile. And compared with non-gaming kids, they get into more arguments and fights and have poorer grades. And then we'll talk about it in class. We know that there is the bio, the psycho, and the social cultural influences of aggression. And we're going to talk about them more in class as well. You know, genetic influences, alcohol influences, which would be the psychological, having aggressive role models. But we also have to look at the bigger, broader social climate, you know, de-individuation, challenging environmental factors such as crowding and heat, you know, so we're going to talk about that more in class. How can we change? Many factors contribute to aggressive behavior. There are many ways to change such behavior, including learning anger management, communication skills, and avoiding violent media. So I know it's very normal to go and watch and play a lot of games. There's a lot of negative television, but we just need a break from it. And you need to pay attention to your own level of aggression, aggressive level, and your frustration level, right? If you're playing and you're becoming frustrated and maybe you are displacing, remember that defense mechanism, and displacing means like all of a sudden you're frustrated about a game, but then you yell at your little brother because he came in the room, that you maybe want to step back, take a break, do something else, go help your mom make dinner. All right. Gosh, there's so much I'd like to say, but I'm going to just say thank you again. Please give us feedback on these videos. We are going to be talking about making positive change. Go do something good today. And all right, that's it. Take care. Oh, and love. Make sure love is the answer, as Einstein would put it. Take care.